Imagine being inside a steel monster that everyone believes is unstoppable. The thick armor of your Tiger tank surrounds you, the rumble of its engine feels like invincibility itself. For months, German crews had been told they were kings of the battlefield, untouchable by enemy fire. But then came a new sound, a sharp hiss, a thunderous crack, and in seconds that feeling of safety vanished. From hidden trenches and ruined villages, American soldiers raised strange tubes on their shoulders. These were the bazookas, weapons that could pierce steel and turn giants into burning coffins. Behind them rolled American tank destroyers, fast and deadly, hunting down the very machines once thought unbeatable. German crews who had once laughed at infantry now trembled with every shadow, every ruined wall, every ambush. The war had changed, and fear had entered the heart of the Panzer. World War II was not just a clash of nations, it was a clash of machines. Nowhere was this more evident than in the battle between German armor and American ingenuity. The German tanks, from the fearsome Tiger to the sleek Panther, were designed to dominate. Their crews believed they were driving fortresses on tracks, immune to the weapons of ordinary soldiers. For a time, it seemed true. Allied rounds bounced off their steel, and villages fell before their advance. But America refused to bow to the myth of invincibility. Out of desperation and determination came two answers, the shoulder-fired bazooka and the relentless tank destroyer. These weapons were not just machines, they were symbols of adaptation, proof that even the strongest could bleed. For the German crews, each encounter with these new threats brought shock, disbelief, and eventually terror. Suddenly, every battlefield carried the whisper of danger. What had once been their greatest strength, the tank, became a trap waiting to explode. This is the story of how America's bazookas and tank destroyers shattered the confidence of German tank crews, and how fear became as much a weapon as firepower itself. The German steel giants. When German tanks first appeared on the battlefields of Europe, they carried with them an aura of terror. The Tiger I, with its thick armor and devastating 88mm gun, became a legend overnight. Allied soldiers told stories of shells bouncing harmlessly off its sides, of entire units being wiped out by a single well-placed shot. To the German crews, these machines were more than just weapons, they were symbols of power, prestige, and invulnerability. Inside the steel walls of their panzers, men felt like masters of the battlefield. For months, this sense of dominance seemed unshakable. In the open fields of Russia and the hedgerows of France, German armor rolled forward with confidence. Their opponents scrambled desperately to find answers, but time and again the Tiger and Panther emerged victorious. Crews grew bold, some even arrogant, laughing at the thought of infantry daring to challenge them. In their eyes, tanks were untouchable, and their enemies' attempts to resist were little more than acts of futility. But what the German crews did not know was that the Allies were watching, learning, and adapting. The myth of invincibility would not last forever. Soon, a weapon designed to fit on the shoulder of a single soldier would begin to change everything they believed about war. The birth of the bazooka. By 1942, the Allies understood one brutal truth: conventional rifles and machine guns were useless against German heavy armor. Something new was needed, a weapon that could give the ordinary soldier the power to kill a tank. In secret workshops across America, engineers worked with urgency, experimenting with explosives and launch tubes. Out of this desperation came an invention that looked almost laughable at first glance, a simple metal tube, light enough for a man to carry on his shoulder. But inside that tube was an idea that would change the battlefield. The rocket-propelled grenade. The U.S. Army called it the M1 rocket launcher, but soldiers quickly gave it a new name, the bazooka, after a comedian's musical instrument that it resembled. This humble weapon could fire a shape-charge warhead capable of burning through inches of armor. For the first time, infantrymen no longer had to feel helpless as German tanks crushed their defenses. They could strike back. When the bazooka made its debut in North Africa and later in Europe, German crews were stunned. Suddenly, from behind rubble or hedgerows, a flash of fire and smoke would erupt, followed by the sickening punch of metal tearing apart armor. What looked like a toy in the hands of a young American private became the nightmare of tank commanders. The battlefield had shifted, and fear began to creep into the steel giants that once felt immortal. The first encounters and shock. The first time German crews faced the bazooka in real combat, the reaction was disbelief. In villages across North Africa, Panzer units advanced with the same confidence they had carried since the Blitzkrieg. But hidden among the ruins, American infantrymen lay in wait, bazookas balanced on their shoulders. At first, German tankers laughed when they saw the odd tubes. How could such a crude weapon possibly harm the armored beasts of the Reich? That laughter ended the moment the first rocket struck. A fiery blast slammed into the side of a Panzer III, and the crew inside was thrown into chaos as flames erupted through the compartment. Survivors staggered out, their uniforms scorched, their belief in invulnerability shattered. Reports from the front describe commanders ordering tanks to pull back, confused and shaken by this unexpected threat. In Italy, the effect was even more dramatic. Tigers and Panthers, once feared by Allied infantry, found themselves hunted in narrow streets where bazooka teams lurked around every corner. A single soldier with steady aim could immobilize a machine worth millions of Reichsmarks. The German crews, who once believed they owned the battlefield, were suddenly checking every window, every hedgerow, every alley. Fear began to settle into their minds. For the first time, German tankers realized that death could come not just from another tank or artillery shell, but from a lone American private hiding in the rubble. The bazooka had rewritten the rules of war. America's tank destroyers entered the battlefield. While the bazooka gave the ordinary soldier a chance to fight back, the U.S. Army knew that larger, faster solutions were needed to counter Germany's armored spearheads. This led to the creation of an entirely new class of war machine, the tank destroyer. Unlike traditional tanks, these vehicles were built with one purpose only: to hunt and kill enemy armor. Speed was valued over heavy protection, and firepower was maximized to punch through even the thickest German steel. The first of these was the M10 Wolverine, equipped with a powerful 3-inch gun mounted on an open-top turret. It lacked the heavy armor of a Tiger, but its mobility allowed it to strike quickly and retreat before German gunners could respond. Then came the M18 Hellcat, the fastest tracked armored vehicle of the war, capable of speeds up to 55 miles per hour. Its crews learned to dart from cover, unleash their deadly shells, and vanish before the enemy could return fire. Finally, the M36 Jackson appeared, armed with a massive 90mm gun that could slice through the vaunted armor of the Tiger and Panther tanks. German crews, once assured of their superiority, now faced opponents who could outrun them, outmaneuver them, and outgun them. Letters and diaries from Panzer veterans reveal their dread of these American machines, describing them as phantoms that seem to appear, strike, and disappear in an instant. The battlefield was no longer theirs to dominate. With every new tank destroyer that rolled into combat, the myth of German invincibility grew weaker, and the terror of destruction grew stronger inside every steel giant of the Reich. Battlefield encounters of fire and fear. The clash between German armor and America's new weapons was not just theory, it played out in brutal, unforgettable battles across Europe. In the hedgerows of Normandy, German panzer crews rolled forward with confidence, believing the thick bocage terrain gave them cover. But hidden among the trees were American bazooka teams, waiting silently. When the first Tigers appeared, rockets streaked out, striking the beasts at close range. Infantrymen later recalled the terror on German faces as their tanks, once symbols of invincibility, burst into flames within seconds. In the open fields, it was the tank destroyers that wrote their legend. At Ericourt in September 1944, lightly armored M18 Hellcats engaged a much larger German force. Using speed and surprise, the Americans darted between fog and cover, knocking out dozens of Panthers while suffering only light losses. German survivors described the Hellcats as ghosts, appearing out of nowhere, firing, and vanishing before a response could be organized. Another chilling moment came during the Battle of the Bulge. As German tanks pushed through the Ardennes, they were met not only by bazookas but by the heavy punch of the M36 Jackson. The 90mm guns shattered German confidence, destroying even their most feared Tigers. Crews who once felt invulnerable suddenly refused to advance without infantry screens, their nerves frayed by the unseen threat of American firepower. Every encounter left a mark. German soldiers began to whisper about the bazooka and the tank destroyers, stories spreading faster than the tanks themselves. For the first time, the hunters had become the hunted. Fear inside the steel giants. For German tank crews, the battlefield had once been a place of pride. Sitting inside a Tiger or a Panther was like being part of an elite brotherhood. But as the bazooka and the tank destroyers began to change the balance of power, that pride gave way to something far darker, fear. Survivors wrote in their diaries about the constant anxiety of ambush. A ruined farmhouse, a quiet hedgerow, even the shadows of a city street, all of them could hide a lone American with a bazooka. Tankers who once charged forward now hesitated, scanning every corner, every window, waiting for the sudden flash that could end their lives in an instant. The silence of battle was no longer reassuring, it was terrifying, because it meant someone might be waiting. Inside the tanks, fear grew heavier. The roar of the engine, once a comforting sound, became a reminder of the fire trap they sat inside. Crews whispered among themselves about the Hellcats and Jacksons, how these American machines could strike at ranges they thought were safe. Even the thick armor of the Tiger no longer guaranteed survival. Veterans later admitted that the psychological toll was worse than the physical losses. It wasn't just that tanks were being destroyed, it was that the sense of invincibility was gone. A German tanker once remarked, "Every time we climbed inside, we wondered if we were stepping into our tomb." That single line captured the shift perfectly, from pride and power, to dread and doubt. The shattering of tank invincibility. For years, German tanks had been wrapped in the myth of invincibility. Allied soldiers whispered about the Tigers and Panthers as if they were monsters born of steel and fire. German propaganda reinforced this legend, spreading the belief that their armor was untouchable, their gunners unmatched. Even German crews began to believe it, until reality shattered the illusion. The arrival of American bazookas and tank destroyers struck at the heart of this myth. Suddenly, a single infantryman could stop a Tiger. Suddenly, a lighter, faster vehicle could outmaneuver and kill the most powerful machines in the Reich. Stories spread like wildfire across the front, Tigers burning in narrow French villages, Panthers knocked out by Hellcats darting across open fields, entire Panzer columns halted by weapons once dismissed as weak. Each story chipped away at the aura of invincibility. For the German crews, this collapse was devastating. Confidence had been their armor as much as steel, but once it cracked, fear rushed in. Orders to advance were met with hesitation. Crews questioned whether their tanks would survive another battle. Some even confessed that they no longer trusted the machines that had once been their pride. By late 1944, the myth of German tank supremacy was broken beyond repair. The Allies had shown that technology, courage, and adaptation could level the battlefield. And for German tankers, the realization was cruel. The invincible giants they commanded were no longer gods of war, but vulnerable targets, hunted and destroyed with terrifying efficiency. The bravery of American infantry with bazookas. The bazooka was a weapon of opportunity, but it required extraordinary courage to use. Facing a German Tiger or Panther was not just about pulling a trigger. It meant standing your ground against a steel monster that could crush you beneath its tracks or blast you apart with a single shell. Yet, countless American infantrymen chose to do exactly that. In Normandy, soldiers crawled through hedgerows with bazookas strapped to their backs, waiting for the thunder of engines. They knew they had only seconds to aim, fire, and escape before the tank's machine guns tore their positions apart. Still, they rose, fired their rockets, and watched in grim silence as explosions rocked the enemy's armor. Many never lived to fire a second shot, but their bravery inspired those around them. Stories of these men spread quickly. Infantry squads would name and remember the soldiers who destroyed a Tiger with a single bazooka, turning them into legends within their units. For those on the ground, these victories weren't just tactical wins, they were proof that courage and determination could defeat even the most feared weapons of the Reich. German crews, on the other hand, came to dread these lone warriors. They realized that an American private, hidden behind a wall or lying in the mud, could bring an armored column to a halt. No tank commander could relax, because bravery with a bazooka could appear anywhere, at any time. In the end, the bazooka wasn't only a weapon of steel, it was a weapon of willpower, carried by soldiers who refused to be crushed by the myth of German invincibility. Tank against tank destroyer. The clash between German tanks and American tank destroyers became one of the most dramatic contests of the war. Unlike bazookas, these were duels of giants, steel beasts facing off across fields and villages, where only speed, accuracy, and nerve decided who lived and who died. The M18 Hellcat was perhaps the most feared of all. It lacked the heavy armor of a Tiger, but its unmatched speed allowed it to dance across the battlefield. Crews used hit-and-run tactics, darting from cover, firing, then disappearing before German gunners could adjust their aim. At Ericourt, Hellcats destroyed dozens of Panthers in swirling fog, leaving German survivors stunned that such a light vehicle could inflict such devastation. The M36 Jackson, armed with its massive 90mm gun, brought raw firepower to the fight. At long ranges, it could pierce even the thick armor of Tigers. German crews, who once felt untouchable, suddenly found themselves outgunned, their shells bouncing off while American rounds tore through their machines. These duels were not just technical battles, they were psychological wars. German tankers, once sure of victory, began to dread the silhouette of a tank destroyer on the horizon. Letters from veterans admitted the shame of retreating from lighter, faster American vehicles, describing them as hunters. While their own tanks became the hunted. Each clash proved that supremacy on the battlefield was no longer guaranteed by heavy armor alone. Skill, speed, and innovation had shifted the balance. And with every destroyed Tiger and Panther, the legend of invincibility slipped further into history. The voices of fear, German diaries and letters. The most haunting evidence of the impact America's bazookas and tank destroyers had on German tank crews does not come from battlefield reports, but from the words of the men themselves. In diaries, letters home, and post-war interviews, German tankers revealed the depth of their fear. These were not the voices of propaganda, they were the raw confessions of soldiers who had faced a nightmare. One Panther gunner wrote to his family in late 1944, "Every wall hides death. Every corner holds a soldier with the fire of a dragon in his hands. We no longer trust our armor. We sit in coffins of steel." Another crewman described the Hellcats as shadows that move faster than our eyes can follow. Such words stripped away the myth of invincibility, exposing the human terror inside the steel beasts. Even officers, once proud of their armored divisions, admitted the growing dread. Reports to headquarters noted that morale among tank crews was faltering. Some refused to advance without infantry protection, others begged for new tactics to counter the American weapons. But no strategy could erase the memory of seeing a comrade's Tiger explode in a ball of fire, undone by a single rocket or a swift tank destroyer. These personal accounts reveal something numbers cannot. It was not just machines being destroyed, it was the spirit of the crews inside. By the end of 1944, German tankers no longer looked at their vehicles as invincible fortresses. They looked at them as fragile shells, carrying men whose courage was being eaten away by an enemy they had once dismissed as weak. A shift in strategy. The arrival of bazookas and tank destroyers did more than frighten German crews, it forced a complete rethink of battlefield strategy. Until then, armored warfare had been dominated by the idea of heavy steel crushing everything in its path. The Blitzkrieg had relied on fast-moving tanks to spearhead assaults, shattering defenses and racing deep into enemy lines. But when American weapons began cutting down those spearheads, the formula no longer worked. German commanders quickly realized that tanks could no longer operate alone. Infantry support became mandatory, not optional. Crews that once charged boldly ahead now waited for foot soldiers to clear ambushes, slowing the momentum that had made blitzkriegs so effective. In cities and villages, tanks hesitated to enter narrow streets without protection, fearful of bazooka teams lurking in the shadows. The very mobility that had given Germany its early victories was now crippled by caution. On the Allied side, strategy shifted as well. Instead of avoiding German armor, American forces actively hunted it. Tank destroyer battalions were deployed specifically to counter enemy panzers, moving quickly to block breakthroughs and turn attacks into ambushes. Infantry squads were trained to operate bazookas in teams, setting traps that combined courage with firepower. The psychological impact amplified the strategic one. German advances slowed, German defenses weakened, and the aura of armored supremacy faded. What had once been Germany's greatest strength, the tank, became a liability, requiring resources and precautions that drained the Reich's already struggling war machine. In this way, the humble bazooka and the swift tank destroyer did more than destroy machines of steel. They destroyed the very doctrine that had carried Germany across Europe, rewriting the rules of modern warfare forever. By the closing months of 1944, the legend of German armor had been dismantled piece by piece. The Tiger and the Panther still looked terrifying on the battlefield. But the aura of invincibility was gone. To Allied soldiers, they were no longer untouchable monsters, they were targets. And to the men inside them, they were no longer fortresses, they were fragile prisons that could ignite at any moment. Every encounter reinforced the lesson. German tank crews had once been hunters, roaring across Europe with unmatched confidence. Now they became cautious, second-guessing every movement, fearful of the unseen enemy waiting in the hedgerows or racing across the fields in a Hellcat. The balance of power had shifted. America's bazookas and tank destroyers had not only given Allied forces the tools to fight, they had stripped away the myth that had carried German armor for so long. The psychological blow was perhaps the most devastating of all. When a soldier believes he is invincible, he fights without fear. But when that belief is broken, courage erodes, hesitation takes root, and defeat becomes inevitable. German crews, once the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, now carried doubt into every battle. In the great sweep of history, the fall of the tank's invincible image was more than a battlefield change, it was a turning point in the war itself. The steel giants of the Reich had met their match, not in bigger guns or thicker armor, but in the ingenuity, courage, and adaptability of their enemies. The story of German tank crews facing America's bazookas and tank destroyers is more than a tale of weapons. It is the story of how belief itself can be shattered. For years, German armor had symbolized dominance. The Tiger and Panther were more than machines, they were legends. But legends die when faced with innovation, courage, and the will to adapt. Every bazooka fired by a lone soldier, every shell launched by a Hellcat or Jackson, chipped away at the illusion of invincibility. German crews who once saw themselves as kings of the battlefield came to fear every shadow, every silence, every approaching step in the rubble. The battlefield had turned against them, and with it, so had history. In the end, the downfall of German tank supremacy reminds us of a simple truth: no weapon, no matter how powerful, is beyond defeat. The steel monsters of the Reich were undone not by their equals, but by men who refused to be intimidated, and by weapons born out of necessity. The hunters became the hunted, and fear became the most powerful weapon of all.